Hey guys, Luke on Sean's channel. Today I'm bringing back the Cyber Dragons. I made a profile on these guys about a month or two ago, and the video was received quite well, but we did have a lot of people in the comments that were offering more suggestions, so I decided to try out some other tech options and see what ways that they can improve the deck, and I have to say I'm very impressed. There was a lot of small engines I overlooked, a lot of synergies from new cards I never really considered before, so I decided to rebuild the deck, and although I still stand by my old deck profile, I still think that's a very valid and viable deck. This is just another way that you guys can play it, so we'll keep the previous one the best Cyber Dragon deck profile, but this is going to be the ultimate Cyber Dragon deck profile. So without further ado, let's jump straight into it. We're going to keep Cyber Dragon at 3. This is going to be a constant no matter what. You always want a Cyber Dragon at 3 copies. He's the namesake of the deck. But another big reason why we want to run it as 3 copies, because with the likes of cards like Disablaster, it gave us more reason to run more copies of Machine Duplication. So we definitely think that that's more important now. We're focusing on Machine Duplication, because what Machine Duplication does is it can use one of your smaller Cyber Dragon monsters, and since their name are Cyber Dragon in the field, if you use Machine Duplication on them, they bring out 2 Cyber Dragons, which is absolutely crazy for the Xyz plays going into Nova or into Infinity, or it's just good to have like all these guys in rotation for our fusion summoning as well. So definitely, without a doubt, run 3 copies of Cyber Dragon. 3 copies of Core. Core, of course, is essential as well. Core is mandatory on summon, that when this card is normal summoned, you need to search your deck for a Cyber Spell and Trap and add it to your hand, which is absolutely great, but that's not the only purpose of Core. As I said, pretty much all of our small Cyber Dragon monsters such as Core, Herz, and Nachster have the effect that their name is Cyber Dragon while on the field or in the graveyard. So if you use Machine Duplication on any of these guys, rather than bringing out 2 more copies of Core, you actually bring out 2 more copies of Cyber Dragon, which is very, very good. But not only that, Core has another effect in the graveyard, that if you control no monsters and Core is in the graveyard and your opponent controls a monster, you can actually banish Core from the graveyard in order to special summon the Cyber Dragon monster from your deck, which is absolutely insane. Of course, you can only activate one or the other Core effect per turn. You can't search a Cyber Spell Trap and then send it to the graveyard and then use the other effect. You have to use one or the other, which we don't really mind because the primary effect of Core is for searching, so that's mainly what you're going to be using for anyways. Definitely recommend running it at 3 copies in the build. 2 copies of Herz and 1 copy of Nachster. I know some people were saying that Nachster needs to be run at more copies, but I really don't think so. I think with all my playtesting, I still think Nachster only deserves to be at 1 copy in this deck. But I definitely want to keep Herz at 2. So Herz has 2 effects, but you can only use one or the other per turn. Either first one is when it's special summoned, you can make this level of Herz become level 5, which is fine, but we don't really care too much about that considering we have a lot more level 5s in this deck now. We mostly use a secondary effect that if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add 1 Cyber Dragon from your deck or graveyard to your hand. The fact that it says deck or graveyard is really important because it specifically says Cyber Dragon, so either you're adding Cyber Dragon specifically from your deck, or you can add one of the monsters that's name is Cyber Dragon in the graveyard. So if you have Herz sent to the graveyard while you have Core in the graveyard as well, what you can actually do is use Herz effect to add that Core from graveyard to your hand, because Core in graveyard is known as Cyber Dragon. So that's a very, very important tech option for you guys to know. Nachster is very good too because it's a little combo that you can do with Nachster and original Cyber Dragon in your hand. That Nachster, you can discard 1 other monster and then special summon the Nachster from your hand. And then if he is normal or special summoned, you can target 1 machine monster with 2100 attack or defense in your graveyard and then special summon it. Which is great because if you're using Nachster's effect and pitching Cyber Dragon, you can actually special summon that Cyber Dragon out when Nachster hits the field, which is of course very, very good for some link plays and good to get more bodies on the field. So I definitely stand by the fact that running Nachster at 1. I don't think he's worth running any more than that. I actually do think this is the ideal ratio. I've been playtesting this a lot and seriously this is ideal. Now the only Cyberdark monster that's of value for this deck is of course Cyberdark Chimera. Seriously, if you want to play Cyberdarks, go ahead, but don't play too many Cyberdarks in your Cyber Dragon build. It could really, really taint the deck. Cyberdark Chimera I find to be actually pretty good though, because you can actually use a combo with Core that you're able to search your Cyberdark Realm, and then Realm is able to search Chimera, and then you can get an additional normal summon of Chimera off of your Realm. The reason why Chimera is so good is that you can discard a spell or trap card from your hand in order to search your Power Bond. But not only that, if this effect goes through and you search your Power Bond successfully off of Chimera, once this turn when you fusion summon, you can banish monsters from your graveyard as material as well, which is just absolutely insane. If you're able to like Miracle Fusion with the likes of Power Bonds, that's just really, really good at getting out a really big monster without committing too much materials from your hand or field. It's really fantastic because it doesn't leave us too short on resources from our hand or field. So I definitely recommend you run that small Cyberdark package in the build. I wouldn't run any other Cyberdark cards. If you want to play Cyberdark, that's fine, but this is a Cyber Dragon build. 1 copy of Chimera. I'm not gonna lie, I completely missed out on this card. I honestly, when it comes to new sets, I kind of just haven't been paying too much attention. So seeing this as a recommendation in the comments, I'm actually really grateful for you guys suggesting it, because Disablaster, the Negation Fortress, is an insane card, and it just gels so well with Cyber Dragons. It's a pendulum monster, but it's also a light machine. Pendulum effect doesn't come up too often, but it's still pretty good if your opponent has like a set card in their pendulum zone, or even if they're playing pendulums and then you want to kind of like stop their pendulum monster's effect going off. Disablaster has the effect that when it's in the pendulum zone, you can negate any card effects activated in this card's column, which is absolutely insane. If pendulums ever have like a really powerful meta-defining deck in the future, I think Cyber Dragons might actually be really good at going rogue against them. Columns are very important for this card because it has the monster effect that if there is a column with no cards, you can special summon this card from your hand to a zone in that column, which is absolutely fantastic. But you can only special summon once per turn this way. But when Disablaster is on the field, you can negate any card effects activated in this card's column, which is absolutely insane. And I'll tell you why now, is because this card has 500 attack and it is a machine monster. This card is the reason we run Machine Duplication at 2 copies in this build, because we can Machine Duplication Disablaster. And the reason why that's so good is that with Disablaster, we're able to get 2 more copies of it onto the field, and then when they're on the field, we can clog up zones that our opponents need to get their effects to pop off. So say for example, it's on the field right here, and then our opponent, now the 2 extra monster zones are right here. If we're able to Machine Duplication Disablaster and get out 2 more copies of it, what we're able to do is, since they are in the columns with the extra monster zones, our opponent can activate effects of monsters in the extra monster zone, which is absolutely insane. It can really shut off a lot of their plays. I definitely recommend you guys run the card at 3 copies. I think it is fantastic, and it's still relatively cheap right now. I mean, I completely missed it altogether. I'm sure probably a few other people did, but I think it just works really well in Cyber Dragons. Not only that, it's a light level 5, so you can actually use this as material to go into Nova. Just everything about this card works really well for the archetype. Definitely maximize it at 3 copies. I still run 2 copies of Galaxy Soldier. I know Disablaster might be kind of like making Galaxy Soldier irrelevant at this point, but I still find Galaxy Soldier to be pretty good. It's an easy body on the field, which can be good for some of our fusion plays such as the Fortress Dragon, but also our plays to go into Nova as well. But 2 links in this build can use Galaxy Soldier, such as Ursiga or SP, so I definitely think Galaxy Soldier still deserves its spot in this build, especially because the Galaxy Soldier Herz combo is just an easy way to go for Infinity, so I definitely recommend you running it at 2 copies still in this build. 1 copy of Jizukiru, the Star Destroying Kaiju, still an all-star in this deck. I love decks that have searchable Kaijus. I think they're really important, especially for going second builds, so he still earns a spot in this deck. Only run it at 1 though, because you can run the other 2 in the side if needs be. Another card I missed completely this year, but actually does blend quite well into this archetype, is Carnot the Eternal Machine. Honestly, it's a good extender, and it's a good way to get another powerful body on the field, because Carnot cannot be normal summoned or set. It must first be special summoned from your hand or graveyard during a duel in which your opponents activated a monster effect in their hand or in their graveyard, which is so common nowadays. Of course, you're going to get hand trapped. Of course, your opponent's going to activate monster effects in hand and in their graveyard. That's just the way Yu-Gi-Oh is now. So you have absolutely no problem bringing him out. If you're going second, you can probably bring him out on your first turn, because your opponent is definitely going to be activating effects from hand or graveyard during the duel. You can only special summon once per turn, but also once per turn, if your opponent activates a monster effect, except during the damage step, you can make this card gain 1000 attack, which is insane because he's already at 3k, so you can just get him up to 4k really easily. And not only that, if this card is sent to the graveyard, except from the hand or deck, you can shuffle this card into the deck. So it's just a fantastic card, kind of like recycle back in as well. We can easily get him into the graveyard as well off of Chimeratech Rampage Dragon's effect too, because Rampage Dragon sends light machine monsters to the graveyard from deck, which of course Carnot is, so I definitely recommend running him at 1 copy in this build. 1 copy of Therion King Regulus. He's a nerf machine, so he doesn't gel in too exceptionally well with this build, but considering that it's essential to run 3 copies of Clockwork Night, and if Clockwork Night's in the graveyard, we're able to banish it to search for an Earth Machine, means that we can very easily search out Regulus if our plays get interrupted. So it's a good way to have a negation on the field, so I definitely recommend you guys running it at 1 copy in this build. Hand traps now, I didn't go crazy with hand traps just because I know that this is a going second build, so I kind of wanted to focus a bit more on board breakers rather than hand traps, but I still think 2 copies of Ash Blossom and 2 copies of Droll are of course very good for this build, so I definitely recommend running 2 of each. If you guys want to change out for whatever hand trap is kind of like better against a matchup, then absolutely go ahead, or whatever you think is like really going to be crippling to the meta, absolutely switch it out. That's just the ratios that I like to run it at personally. Going into the spells now, 3 copies of Cyber Emergency. This is the searcher of the deck, where it's able to add any Cyber Dragon monster from our deck to our hand off Cyber Emergency, essential to run at 3 copies in the build. We also run 1 copy of Cyber Repair Plant. This is another searcher, but what makes this a little bit better is the fact that it can search a few more cards that Cyber Emergency just can't. Base number of Cyber Dragons in your graveyard, you can activate either 1 or both of these effects. If you only have 1 Cyber Dragon in the graveyard, you can activate 1 effect, but if you have 3 or more Cyber Dragons in the graveyard, you can activate them both. So you can add 1 light machine monster from your deck to your hand, which is great for searching the Kaiju or even Carnot if we want. Or you can target 1 light machine monster in your graveyard and shuffle that target into the deck. So it's a good bit of recycling as well. I definitely recommend running Repair Plant at 1 copy. 1 copy of Cyber Revsystem. I know a lot of people just didn't really get why I played this card from the last profile, but seriously, I do still think it deserves its spot. It's just a really good extender. So if we're trying to build a board and we need materials for link plays, but we also need some stuff in order to fusion summon, Cyber Revsystem is very important because it can just recycle some of the Cyber Dragons that we use for our links so that we have them on the field for our contact fusions and fusion plays. I genuinely think it's just a really good card, and with a lot of play testing, it does get you out of some tight situations too, so I definitely recommend running Cyber Revsystem at 1 copy. If you don't want to, that's fine, but seriously, after all the playtesting I did, I definitely think you need to run it at 1. Cyberdark Realm, as mentioned earlier, is that Cyberdark continuous spell card that we can add off of Core's effect. The main purpose of Realm is that when we activate it, we're able to search the Cyberdark Chimera. And not only that, we can also use Realm as effect to do an additional normal summon of that Cyberdark Chimera in order for plays to get going, so I definitely recommend you guys running it at 1 copy in this deck. Final cyber spell we run is Cyberload Fusion. You can fusion 1 fusion monster from your X deck that lists a Cyber Dragon monster as material by shuffling the fusion materials listed on it into the deck from one of the cards on the field and or face of banished card. This I find to be really good just because there's a lot of banishing decks out there right now that are going to be big meta contenders in the future. You still see Kashtira out there topping some tournaments with the likes of the Kashtira Fiendsmith. Malice is going to be another big deck that's going to be quite problematic going into the new year. So I think it's really good that we're able to kind of like shuffle back some of our resources that get banished with the Cyberload Fusion. But not only that, sometimes we use some fusion cards in order to banish our stuff to bring out fusion monsters. So it's a good way to just kind of like recycling those things back in. So I definitely recommend running Cyberload Fusion at 1 copy in this build because we don't want our deck completely running out of steam too quickly. So 1 copy is essential. Speaking of the fusion cards that we use that have the potential to banish monsters, of course we have the 1 copy of Overload Fusion. Special summons 1 Dark Machine Fusion monster from the X deck with banishing fusion materials listed on it from the field or graveyard. Of course, we have Power Bond as well, which if we're using it with the likes of Cyberdark Chimera, we're going to be banishing materials in order to go into our monsters. And finally, another card that I missed from the last profile is Heavy Polymerization. Heavy Polymerization is pretty good. I think it might be a little bit situational, but it still has a good purpose, and I still like to recommend it in this build. Heavy Polymerization may seem like just a typical fusion spell using 3 or more monsters, but what you can actually do is that you can banish monsters from your X deck as material up to the number of monsters that your opponent controls, but you lose life points equal to the total attack of monsters banished this way when the monster is fusion summoned. So it's actually a good way of kind of like not using up too much materials from our hand and field when we're going into something. One of the main reasons we use Heavy Polymerization is to go into our Chimeratech Rampage Dragon, which specifically needs 2+ Cyber Dragon monsters to go into it, which you may be confused as in what exactly would you be using, considering most of your Cyber Dragon fusions are Chimeratech monsters. but actually using your Cyber Dragon Infinity and Cyber Dragon Nova, since they count as Cyber Dragon monsters, you can use them as the fusion material, which can just be really, really insane because their attacks are both 2100, so you're not even taking a whole bunch of damage. You're not really guaranteeing yourself a death sentence with it. So I definitely recommend it as a good additional fusion card. I think it's pretty good. If you guys want to cut it, that's fine too. I like experimenting with this deck anyway, so who knows, maybe in the future I might get rid of it. For the time being, I think it's a pretty fun card. So I definitely say you guys should run at one copy in the build. One copy of Duality. I think Duality is pretty good because it really helps me like end games as quickly as possible, especially when we're contact fusing our opponent's whole board for the Chimeratech Fortress Dragon. What we're able to do is activate Duality and tag out that Fortress Dragon for Twin Dragon, which is able to do the additional bit of damage. And considering that Duality is a quick play spell, you can of course use this during the battle phase. So I still think it's worth running at one copy. Now we run 2 copies of Machine Duplication. I up this because of Disablaster. Not only is Machine Duplication good because you're able to target your small Cyber Dragons on the field in order to bring out 2 Cyber Dragon, but also considering that Disablaster is a light machine with 500 attack, it's a good Machine Duplication target in order to bring out 2 more copies of it. So I definitely think it's worth running at 2 in this deck. If you guys want to run it at 3, that's absolutely fine, but I also run Thrust in this build, so there's no need to extend it too much. 3 copies of Clockwork Night. Clockwork Night is great because what this does is all face-up monsters on the field become machine monsters, but not only that, the machines that you control gain 500 attack, and the machine monster your opponent controls lose 500 attack. So that's just a good way of getting us some advantage when we're going in for OTKs. But also the fact that it turns all of our opponent's monsters into machines means that it's perfectly ideal for us to go into our Chimeratech Fortress Dragon using all of the monsters that our opponent controls as material. That's the main reason you run Clockwork Night. But not only that, it also has a very good hidden effect that if it's in the graveyard, you can banish it and discard 1 card to search for an Earth machine monster, which of course is your Regulus, which can be very, very good. So I definitely recommend you guys running it at 3 copies. Going into board breakers now, this is still a going second deck at heart. I like to run 2 copies of Lightning Storm and 2 copies of Forbidden Droplet. I just think that these are the ideal board breakers, but considering that we still run hand traps in the build, I didn't think it's overly necessary to run too many board breakers. I think these are more than enough for what we need, and I think that this is the ideal ratio, so that's what I recommend for the build. 1 copy of Call by the Grave because this is a combo deck. We do not want to get interrupted, so do run it at 1. And then finally, to round things out, we run the 2 copies of Thrust. Thrust is just great for searching out some of our more powerful spells, such as the complete wipeout of Lightning Storm, the great extender of Machine Duplication, or even some of our other fusion spells such as the Overload Fusion or Heavy Polymerization. It can even search or Searcher Cyber Dragon Emergency. I just think it's a really, really powerful card, so I definitely recommend you guys running it at 2 copies in the build. Going into the extract now, 1 copy of Cyber Dragon Seeger. Seeger is great and he's in fact an OTK enabler, especially when we're pairing it with a Rampage Dragon. Seeger needs 2 machine monsters including Cyber Dragon in order to go into him, and during each battle phase, if this card does not declare an attack, it can quick effect target 1 machine monster you control with 2100 or more attack, and then for the rest of this turn, that monster gains 2100 attack and defense. Also, neither player takes any battle damage from attacks involving this monster, which is just fantastic because especially if we're pairing Seeger with Rampage Dragon, we can get Rampage Dragon up to 4200 attack, and if you're in a position where you already activate his ability to attack 3 times, that's 4200 into your opponent 3 times, which is just fantastic for rounding out games. 1 copy of SP Little Knight. Thank God this card is way more accessible now because it is a very, very powerful card, but it's been reprinted a whole bunch now over the past 2 months. So it's a lot easier to get. All it takes is 2 effect monsters in order to go into her. If she's linked someone using a Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, or Link monster material, you can actually target 1 card on the field or in either graveyard and straight up banish it. But not only that, she's also a good interruption because when your opponent activates a card or effect, you can quick effect target 2 face-up monsters on the field, including a monster that you control, and banish both of them until the end phase. If we don't manage to OTK, going into SP Little Knight and then passing on to our opponent is still quite a nice interruption, so I definitely recommend you running it at 1 copy in the deck. 1 copy of Salamangreat Almirage. Almirage is great. I mostly use it because if we normal summon core and get a link core into Almirage in order to make our Cyber Repair Plant live, it can be quite good, but I will say on the horizon there's a new card called Clockwork Night coming out, which I think will ultimately replace Almirage altogether, so definitely keep an eye out for that. But for the time being, Almirage is still a fine card to play. 2 copies of Cyber Dragon Nova and 2 copies of Cyber Dragon Infinity. I was considering kind of like cutting down the ratios because the extra deck is getting very tight now. But the reason why I still kept these guys at 2 each not only is because of how powerful they are, but also because they can be used as fusion material for our heavy polymerization as well if needs be. So I still think it's worth running it at 2 copies each. Nova is so much easier to go into now thanks to the Disablaster, so it's no problem for us to go into him a lot more now. And Infinity is just one of the most insane boss monsters out there. It's an Omni Negate that also gains attack for each material attached to him, and also it can suck up material from your opponent's side of the field too. These are just some very powerful cards. I definitely recommend running it at 2 copies each. And of course Zeus, because we're playing XZs, might as well play Zeus as well. Zeus is an insane board wipe. He's not even once per chain, and we're able to overlay it onto Infinity after Infinity sucks up one of our opponent's monsters. It's just more material for Zeus to really pop off, so I definitely recommend you guys running it at 1 copy in this build. But not only that, it's also a machine, so it synergizes very well. Now, a monster that I missed, but mostly just because it was quite expensive, I didn't want to fully commit to buying it, is Chaos Angel. But just after like testing it online, I do think it is an essential card to be running in this build, especially because of the likes of Disablaster as well. Chaos Angel is a Synchro 10 monster that needs a material of 1 tuner and 1+ non-tuner light or dark monsters. But for the Synchro summon of him, you can treat 1 light or dark monster you control as a tuner, which means it's just so much more accessible for us to play it as well, especially along with the Disablaster and Machine Dupe, or even sometimes the Chaos Angel might be a little bit better to go into than Nova. If she's special summoned, you can target 1 card in the field and just banish it, so it's really good at removing some of her opponent's problematic cards. But also this card gains these effects based on the original attribute of material used for a Synchro summon. So if you're using lights, which of course this deck is a light deck, so it's going to be most likely having this effect, it means Synchro monsters you control are unaffected by monster effects activated by your opponent. So it's a good kind of like built-in protection for Chaos Angel to be unaffected by your opponent's monster effects. But also, if you use a dark monster to go into Chaos Angel, it makes monsters you control cannot be destroyed by battle, which is just absolutely insane. You may think it's actually really hard to have a dark monster to be used material for a Chaos Angel, but it's not the worst for us to go into. Because Chimeratech Rampage Dragon is also a level 5 dark monster, we can actually use the Rampage Dragon as material for us to go into Chaos Angel. So if we manage to not OTK and we still have Rampage Dragon on the field and we still have another level 5, we can just use that Rampage Dragon and that level 5 into Chaos Angel, and Chaos Angel can become a little bit of a towers on its own, because that means with the light it's unaffected by monster effect, and with the dark it cannot be destroyed by battle. So I definitely think it's worth running in this build. I'm really happy I finally got this card. I think it really goes well, especially with the Disablaster engine. I definitely recommend you guys running it at 1 copy in this build. Now, as mentioned before, 2 copies of Chimeratech Rampage Dragon. Rampage Dragon is an absolute beast of an OTK enabler, because we mostly use this to round off games on the spot. When it's fusion summoned, you can target spells and traps on the field up to the number of fusion materials used for its fusion summon and just destroy them, so it's a good way of wiping your opponent's back row. But also, once per turn, you can send up to 2 light machine monsters from your deck to the graveyard, and if you do, for each monster you send to the graveyard off this effect, it gains 1 additional attack during the battle phase. So it's able to attack 3 times in the 1 battle phase, which sounds weak because it only has 2100 attack, but if you're pairing this with Seeger, that's 4200 attack 3 times, so it can really close off the game. I definitely recommend you guys running it at 2 copies, because not only is it good for going in for the OTK, but also it could be great material because it's still a level 5 machine for our Nova in the future, or even our Chaos Angel. I highly recommend you guys running it at 2 copies in the build. 2 copies of Chimeratech Fortress Dragon. This is the best contact fuse monster in the build, especially when we're pairing it with Clockwork Night. Clockwork Night turns all monsters on the field into machine monsters, and Chimeratech Fortress Dragon needs Cyber Dragon and 1 or more machine type monster on the field in order to go into it. So if you Clockwork Night up, all of your opponent's monsters become machine monsters. You're able to special summon Cyber Dragon and just straight away contact fuse them all away, which is just absolutely insane. Definitely recommend you guys running it at 2 copies in this build. I definitely think it's worth it. 1 copy of Chimeratech Megafleet Dragon. This is another monster that we use contact fuse in order to go into, but what we use in order to go into her is using 1 Cyber Dragon monster and then 1+ monsters in the extra monster zone. It's a great way of just getting rid of your opponent's monster in their extra monster zone because it gets rid of them by contact fusing them away, which is really hard for your opponent to kind of like out. So I definitely think Megafleet deserves its spot in the deck. It gains 1200 attack for each number of material used for it, so it's able to easily go up to 2400 attack. I definitely recommend you guys run it at 1 in the build. And finally, rounding things off, one copy of Cyber Twin Dragon. Twin Dragon is great if you're able to go into it off of your power bond because it's able to attack twice, and with its original attack of 28 it can go up to 56 with power bond, and attacking twice with 56 can easily end the game right there. But not only that, Twin is also very good because it's also a level 10 light monster. So what you're able to do is, if you have Chimeratech Force Dragon on the field and you're able to attack him with Force Dragon, you can use Duality, go into Twin, and it can really round off games from there. So I definitely recommend Twin Dragon for rounding off the extra deck. Going into the side deck now, we're kind of just rounding off some play sets. We have 2 copies of the Star Destroying Kaiju. I don't think it's overly necessary to run 3 copies in the main. We're already able to search the one we have in the main, but just on the off chance our opponent playing a deck that has monsters that's really impossible for us to out, I definitely think it's worth it to kind of like run as many kaijus as you possibly can just to make sure that we're able to out those monsters. So I definitely recommend running the extra 2 copies in the side. And in the side we're also rounding off our full play sets of the hand traps we run. So the last copy of Ash and the last copy of Droll is of course really good depending on like what our opponent's playing. So you can choose to either switch these guys in depending what the matchup is. But again, this is entirely dependent on what you're playing against. I think Nibiru is actually pretty good. I know this format Tenpai is a big thing and they mostly summon their monsters during the battle phase. So Nibiru mightn't be so good against the likes of Tenpai. But there are a lot of combo decks in the actual format. And I know a lot of people are like trained in their heads to kind of bring out a negate before they fall victim to Nibiru, but I still think Nibiru can still be quite good just because it's seeing so much less play now. A lot of people just kind of like aren't really expecting it, so it could be a really good way of catching your opponent off guard. Or not even that, if they are setting up a negate under 5 summons to anticipate Nibiru, if we still activate Nibiru, they're still wasting a negate on it, so I still think it's worth it in the grander scheme of things. So I definitely think running it at 3 copies in the side is still pretty good. 2 copies of Cosmic Cyclone just because there's a lot of annoying decks that like have a spell and trap that can be quite problematic. I'm mostly talking about Runic. So we're finding a way to kind of like out those kind of cards. I think Cosmic Cyclone is just the best way to go about it. So definitely run 2 copies in the side. I also like to run limiter removal in the side deck. I think it's a cool way to round off games. And if we know our opponent has like a bunch of like small monsters that we can topple over very easily, having limiter removal to use as sort of a damage step trick can be a really funny way of kind of stealing games right there on the spot. So I definitely think it's worth running at 1 copy in the side. Funnily enough, I've been playing around with having Imperm in the side deck, and it might seem quite strange, but since we're playing Cyber Dragons, I thought it was better for us to just stick with board breakers. But if our opponent kind of knows what we're up to, they might force us to go first. So if we're anticipating that, having 3 copies of Imperm is a good way for us to set up kind of back row when we're going first. So I think it's a good way to kind of catch our opponent off guard. So I think 3 copies of Imperm in the side deck actually works quite well. If you guys disagree with this completely, fine, it's whatever, but I do think you guys should try it in some play testing because for me it actually did work wonders. So 3 copies of Imperm in the side deck, I find it to be quite good. And then rounding things off on the side, we have 1 copy of Dimensional Barrier and 1 copy of Different Dimension Ground because we actually main deck the triple Tactics Trust. So if we're forced to go first and our opponent interrupts us, we can activate that thrust and just set one of these 2 cards that can be quite crippling to our opponent. We might even steal the game from there. So 1 copy of D-Barrier and 1 copy of Different Dimensional Ground I find to be very good at rounding off the side deck. So that about does it for the deck. Please let me know what you guys think. I'm really happy with the way this deck turned out. It's just another alternative way for you guys to play Cyber Dragon. I think some of the tech options that people suggested in the comments were quite fun and I did enjoy playing with them. They're just a lot different from the build I made previously, but still nice to see like other ways you guys can play the deck. It can be completely up to your own judgment if you find this way better or the previous way, but I think it's mostly just down to playing style, however way you want to play the deck itself. If you guys want to try building any of these decks in real life, we have some affiliate links down in the description. So if you use those, you directly help out the channel for myself and Sean to bring you guys more videos like this. If you guys can also consider becoming a channel member, that would of course be really appreciated. You get early access to videos and all the other perks that come along with that. But other ways you guys can support is just by subscribing to the channel and liking the video and leave suggestions in the comment for what you guys want to see in the future. But from us, that's all for the time being. Thanks so much for watching and we'll see you guys next time.